Thank you, Canon Isaacs, and good morning. Oh, that was, I don't have to repeat, that was a good, rousing good morning. Canon Isaac said, in place of the sermon. That's a little bit of pressure. I cannot tell you that I am qualified to deliver anything that could be in place of or even approximate a sermon, but I will say that I am very pleased to have been asked to have this conversation with the church here at St. Cyprian. It is encouraging that a church in a community such as this would charge itself and would be concerned always with reflecting on how we all collectively serve the communities in which we are located. Even though we did not manage to fit it into the traditional month of independence, because I really think that independence is a continuous journey for us all, every month of every year. But even though we did not manage to fit it into November, I do think it is quite fitting to be able to have this conversation among ourselves today on this first Sunday of Advent, when Christians all over the world begin to reflect on the birth and the coming of Christ. Because for many of us who grew up in the Christian church, one of the things that was remarkable and certainly was emblematic of the coming of Christ was the role of Jesus in his community. And the fact that we began to see an idea of Christianity and of Christian service that was and is about being among people. And so I do think that this conversation is fitting as we have it today on this first Sunday of Advent. Now, where I do want to begin this morning is to look at the word that we use in the title and to reflect a little bit on this notion of what it means to empower. What is empowering? And can power really be given from one group of people to another? And I think it is important to start there. I remember when the women's movement, the process by which we were all seeking to get greater equality between men and women, when that started to grow in the Caribbean, which is really one of the birthplaces of that equality movement, empowerment was a word that we heard over and over, and we would talk about women's empowerment. And one of the things I would always think was, well, can another person really empower me? Or is power something that I have to be able to find? So then, does it mean that our role is to create an environment in which people can find their power? Is it our role to create the environment, the circumstances, the tools in which people can claim their power according to their terms and according to the lives that they want to live? And so then, what I would say is that it is not to us to empower a community or to empower a person or anyone, but to create the environment in which they see clearly what is the life, what are the choices that they want to make, what are the choices that they believe will serve. And I do believe that one of the greatest roles of the church is to help people see more clearly what are the kinds of choices that will serve them and help them serve others. So I like to speak then instead about this idea of ownership, about this idea of agency. And when I talk about ownership and agency, I mean simply that people are taking responsibility for their own lives and for creating the lives that they want. Now, our role, the role of the state, the role of the church, the role of schools, the role of institutions, is to create the circumstances in which people can freely and easily take ownership of their own lives and of their own choices. So then, what do we consider to be these tools of ownership? What is it that people need in order to exercise their agency, to do what they want, to do what they choose based on the guidance and the environment that we create in the community? So what are some of these tools of ownership? One is education, quite clearly. And for many of us, for most of us, I believe, living in Barbados, especially those who may be close to my age and in the environment, in the area of my age, education was always, for us and has always been for Barbados, one of the ways that we saw a way out from whatever were the circumstances of our birth. And Barbados has always had that strong tradition. But what we find now, and I'm sure that many of you will agree with me, what we find now is that we did have an education system that served for what it was meant to do. And I always say that Barbados has somehow perfected how can we be very humble and peaceful and unobtrusive in the way that we live. If we look around the Caribbean at some of our sisters and brothers in other countries, we might perhaps see more of a spirit of change, more of a spirit of revolution. But we'll remember that Barbados was meant to be created as the perfect colony where we were meant to demonstrate what good behavior looked like. That's the history of Barbados. That was our Barbados. And I think somehow we grew up in that tradition, and one of the things that we did very well was governance. We were very well governed, we created a very professional public service, and we educated people towards that very polite, professional, educated public service. That's what the education system was for. Now we find that we have to pivot when it comes to education. Now we find that we need to now evolve an education system that teaches, that raises a nation that carves its own path, that raises a nation that is able to make its own choices, that raises individuals that are able to not just go and do, as we say, go and do the people work, but raises a nation of individuals that consider that it is our work, that it is our company, it is our business, it is our small business, it is our innovation. And really to realize something that my mother used to tell me all the time, that nobody don't owe you a living. Nobody is coming to rescue us, that we have to do the work of rescuing ourselves. And so crafting an education system that responds to that is the job of this current generation, if it is that we are not going to not so much empower, but create an environment in which people take ownership of the lives that they live. And one of the other tools of this, and one of the things that we need to use education for in that regard, is to help people to create real wealth and real assets. Now, again, we have had a system where we want people to get a job and get a salary. Real empowerment or real ownership is in making sure that we create generations that leave something for future generations. Surely that is the independence test of this time. That is independence. That is ownership. That is agency. So that we are not just living to be able to have an income to meet our basic needs, but we must be living to be able to make investments for our children and for future generations so that they have a softer landing than we had. Right? The idea is that our children should perhaps have a softer landing, an easier start, and a better way to see their way forward. And the third thing I want to come to quickly in terms of the tools of ownership has to do with what I call self-governance. And it's one of the things that, at the level of the individual and the community, we have to be able to encourage. And what do I mean by that? There's so many times, and I'm sure, Reverend, that you have these conversations as well, that we sit with young people, and as we're talking through a particular choice that they've made, and it's not just young people, to be honest, it's all people. And as we're talking through a particular choice that they've made, they will say, but I got frustrated. But I was just frustrated. And they're telling you about an action that they took or a choice that they make, and they say, well, I got frustrated, and that's what I said. I got frustrated, and that's what I did. And the idea that a feeling is only a feeling is just that. A feeling does not need to dictate to you how you behave. A feeling is something that you perceive, that you experience, and then you get to make a choice about what you do with that feeling. That may sound basic to us, but I wonder how many of us, as we look around and we think about the conflicts that we either watch, observe, or are a part of, how much of that is based on the notion or based on the idea that people are not governing their own feelings. I say to my niece, who's 9 years old, I let her talk about how she feels. I let her say everything about how she feels. I let her cry. I let her say what she's experiencing. And then we have a conversation about the choice that she will now make, which is a different thing. So I think that one of the tools of this ownership that we are seeking to share with our community is this idea of self-governance, management of the self, that really prevents us so many times from making good choices. But now I want to come to perhaps the reason that the Reverend asked me to reflect with you, and that is to look at really what is the role of each of us in our communities. And of course, I have to start with the role of the state. The role of the state in making sure that communities are educated in such a way that they can make the choices that they want, that they can not just get jobs, but they can accumulate wealth for their families and assets for future generations, and that they can have all of the tools to govern the self and make good choices. What is the role of the state in that? Well, you know, I hope, about the efforts in the area of education transformation. And let me just say that there's a big part of the narrative is about the idea of getting rid of one exam. And I want to emphasize that that is perhaps one of the smallest parts of the transformation. I think perhaps one of the largest parts of the transformation that people are not appreciating is it is not the exam that is a challenge. It is the fact that it is a tool for channeling children in certain directions that in many ways determine their future at a time when it is far too early to box a child into that future. The word apartheid is a very loaded word, and I don't think that it should be used lightly. But I think we have to be careful, because an apartheid system where a set of choices is completely shut off from one segment of the population, that can creep in to a society very easily if we are not careful. And if any of you have heard that word used in reference to the Barbados education system, let's think about why. It is because if there are certain schools that have the best resources and that have the best networks by virtue of who goes there, then that creates an apartheid system in education. because it means that all the other children and all the other schools are shut off from a certain kind of educational experience. We do not want that. And so you may hear people say they won't get rid of the exam. It's not about the exam. It is about how are we creating the best chances for our students. Nobody is denying that children have to be tested at various points in their lives. And perhaps 11 years old is one of those points. But it certainly can be one day that determines where you spend the next 7 years. And it certainly can be one day that determines, apart from the physical location that you will be in, whether it's the town or in St. Lucie or in St. Joseph, it can be one day that determines the entire kind of experiences and chances at life that you have based on whether you went to school in town or whether you went to school in St. Joseph. So when you hear people say it's about getting rid of the 11 plus, that's a tiny, tiny, tiny part of it. What it's really about is giving the young people in this community right here in which this church sits the best chance at figuring out what they want to do and the choices that they want to make. But there are other kinds of education, and I really feel that sometimes we focus too much on what happens in schools. I mean, that may sound like a strange thing to say, but this church sits in, and I represent a community where a lot of education is happening on the pastor. A lot of education is happening by the pavilion. A lot of education is happening after all of us are in bed. Children don't close their ears and their eyes because we want them to. A lot of the children in these communities, and it may sound like a controversial thing to say, and I'm glad that my folks have stopped taking video, but I'm going to say it. Regrettably, for many children, school is a formality. Life happens in the community. Many children cannot wait to get home and drop down the bag. They don't know what was in there. And run outside. And that is when life begins. And that is where we need to catch them. We just spent the last 2 weekends repainting and refurbishing the pavilion at Gully Hill. And I'm going to get kind of nice ass to why I raised that now. And why did we do that? Because many of those children come out there on evenings. And if we don't give them something to do, they're going to find something to do. If we don't invest in communities, no matter how much investment we put in the formal education system, we are going to lose some of our young people. And so, while the state has programs like Construction Gateway, which is a program many of you may have heard about, where it is what we call micro-credentialing. So you don't need to go to university for 3 years. You have a shorter term where you're learning skills like tiling and masonry and steel bending and so on. And that is because what is happening now in Barbados is that we are running out of skilled labor in those areas. It may sound kind of strange to our ears, but we are. Why? Because some of the young people that we see who are not working, but they're also not skilled. Now, we have this notion that physical work is easy, or a man could just take up a couple blocks and start laying them down. I know that if somebody come to build my house and they haven't built a house before, I don't want them to build my house because I don't know what's going to start to crack in the middle of the night. So this idea that anybody can just get up and start doing something because it is physical labor and because it is not book work is wrong. It is incorrect. And we did a disservice to the country when we said it is either academic or it is technical. There's a big part of technical work that calls for you to think and engage. And so the Construction Gateway program is one of those. There are programs in cybersecurity and IT, there's a program that is being run by the Ministry of Youth called Project Dawn, where they go into communities and they ask young people, if you were to start a business, what would that business be? And then they help those young people get the tools and the equipment and so on to be able to do those things. And these are things happening at the national level. But I think that there has to be greater investment in community-level training programs. Because regrettably, we still have communities where people don't want to leave, strangely, as small as Barbados is. They're not likely, because they don't have a lot of confidence to step outside of what they know, they're not likely to get up and go to SJPI or to skills training or to an institution where they perceive that they have to act different from their natural inclination. I hope that's making sense. If we don't build confident young people, if we are not raising a confident nation, then when you say to me, but there's the Construction Gateway project, and you can go and fill out a form, and you can catch a bus, and you can go and sit down in a classroom with a bunch of strangers. If they do not have the confidence or the wherewithal to fill out that form, to submit that form, to put the attachments onto the form, to go and find their way on time to this institution and sit there with strangers, they will not go. And sometimes part of our work of empowering local communities, of helping them get that ownership, is to meet them where they are first. Start to build that confidence first. And then ultimately, we will have young people who can go and talk to and engage with anyone, anywhere in Barbados or anywhere in the world. As I close, I want to come very importantly to the role of the community and the institutions in the community. I mentioned earlier the volunteer project that we were doing at the pavilion. And, you know, before I came to political service, I used to listen to politicians, and I used to think, the role of a politician is not to lecture people about how to behave. Because I used to hear a lot of that. The role of someone who is in political service is to do their part to enhance the lives of those they serve. And so please don't take this, what I'm about to say, as any kind of lecturing or moralizing. But I do think that there is a type of governance that a Barbados that is a republic has to start walking towards. That is a type of governance where the state is just one part of the equation, where the government is just one part of the equation. Barbadians are very engaged, and many of us have become commentators on what we see. I read recently where William Blake said that the only really valiant way to complain is to create. William Blake, as we know, was an engraver, a genius who died poor. And he was very concerned with creating. He thought that that was his purpose. And he said, the only valiant way to complain is to create, is to replace the thing that you are complaining about, is to be activists in your complaining and not just observational. And so I feel that the conversation that we all have to have now, and I think that we are trying to have with the constitutional reform and the parliamentary reform and everything else, is what is the role of the state and what is the role of others? I think that in a care a model of governance that's based on care. We realize that the state has to care for individuals. But let me raise the revolutionary idea that the individual and the community also care for the state. And how is that? One of the ways that we do that, and one of the ways that you do that here at St. Cyprian, is with your programs of outreach in the community. And in that way, you are saying, we realize that there are other roles to play other than what the government is doing, and we take up some of that load. But I also think that at an individual level, we must realize that we as people are not just consumers of what the state does or gives. We must also be producers and creators, not just for ourselves, not just for our individual needs, but for the collective needs of the community. And so I believe that the kinds of programs that we've talked about are important as well for the church to participate in. But I would also suggest that there is a certain co-creation that has to happen. What does that mean? That we don't consider, this is my program here at St. Cyprian, and Ms. Caddle is going to do her program over at the Gully Hill. And they're two separate things. Because guess what? The expertise, the guidance, the judgment, the experience that you have, I would like to benefit from in my program at the Gully Hill. And I'm sure that the reverse is true for what you're doing here. What I'm simply saying is, part of how we give ownership to local communities, apart from all of the programs that the state is doing, is by coming together to create together the Barbados that we want. And so one of the things I would love to see is for us to conceptualize together non-state actors, of which the church is one, along with communities, because I consider myself somebody who works in the community. How do we come together to co-create the programs that are going to deliver to the communities that we serve? I believe very much that we are still at the point where we physically have to meet people where they are, where we physically, regrettably, while we help build people's confidence to step out of their comfort zone and go to other places, we physically have to come to them. And so, apart from the things that we do that are giving to people who cannot get for themselves, what is the next level of that we are doing to help create an environment of ownership, where people understand that ultimately each of us is responsible for the lives that we lead, for the choices that we make, and for the outcomes that flow from those choices. Because I perceive that while we have a state that is doing many things to be able to deliver, we also need to come on that other side and help people find their ownership, help people find their agency, and help people realize, one, I have a role to play in living the life that I want, but two, I have a role to play in creating the community that I want my children to be a part of. So I wanted to come and share with you this morning about some of the programs that are available, but I also wanted to come and say to the church here at St. Cyprian this morning that we are here to co-create, to collaborate, to come up with programs that are not either a church thing or a community thing, but that are both, and that begin to deliver the various kinds of formal education and emotional support and guidance that our communities really need in order to thrive and in order to have agency. I thank you for this opportunity, and I wish you a blessed rest of your service.